Welcome to the Hedberg Public Library. Our guest speaker tonight is Greg Peck, editorial page editor of the Janesville Gazette and author of a new book, Death Beyond the Willows. The book relates true Wisconsin history surrounding a 1927 wedding day tragedy that stunned residents of Marshall, Cottage Grove, Portage, and even folks statewide. Greg will sprinkle his talk with selected readings from the book. Afterward, you will have time to ask questions. Greg is a Wisconsin native who graduated with a journalism degree from UW-Oshkosh in 1979. He has spent 26 years in journalism, working for 3 Wisconsin newspapers. He came to Janesville in 1987 as the Gazette's first and only Sunday editor and took over as editorial page director 3 years ago. Greg has won awards in news, editorial, sports, and column writing. Please welcome Greg Peck.
Thank you. It's great to see so many familiar faces here. How many of you grew up on farms? Okay, quite a few. How many had parents that grew up on farms? Almost all of you. Great. How many of you consider the town that you grew up in to be a small town? Quite a few. All right. Well, I didn't grow up on a farm, but I did grow up in a small community. And I grew up in Marshall, a small farming community in Dane County. How many of you know where Marshall is? All right, most of you. Well, it's just 35 miles north of here, for those of you that don't know that. And I can still remember the population sign down the street from where I grew up. And it read population 736. That's how big it was when I was a kid. Now it's probably 3,000 or 4,000 people there. But when I was a teenager attending Marshall High School, I couldn't wait to graduate and leave that town. And I didn't understand what made a community. I thought that a community had to have a shopping mall or a bowling alley or movie theaters or even a fast food joint, someplace for kids to hang out and meet their friends. And Marshall had none of that at the time. But now I can honestly say that I'm proud to call Marshall my hometown because I understand what makes a community special. And let me share 2 stories with you. A few years ago, my wife Cheryl, in the back there in the red, she and I went to Summerfest to a concert at night. And we got back out to the car and found out that my car battery was dead. Now I had jumper cables in the trunk, so it wasn't a big issue. And there was a guy driving through the parking lot, and I just asked him if he'd swing around and help me jump my car. And he said, sure. And then he drove off. Now, back in February 2000, Cheryl and I went back to Marshall to see a boys basketball game. I played basketball in high school. So Marshall was playing Cambridge for the conference championship. So it was kind of a special evening. And we drove there. It was a beautiful February that year. And there was no snow on the ground. And it was such a warm night, I didn't even wear my jacket. And the parking lot was full when we got there. And it was a new school. We had never been there before. And with the parking lot full, people were parking off on an access road to the back and onto the grass. So we just joined them. And we went inside, and Marshall won the game, and they had a nice trophy celebration afterward. And we got back outside and found out it had been raining hard the whole game. And we got to the car and realized that with a front-wheel drive car, it was now sitting underwater, the wheels. And so I tried to inch it back out, and it just spun, of course. And so Cheryl jumped in to try to ease it back out, and I pushed. And pretty soon I'm full of mud and water, and it's no use. But there's a couple driving by, and they jump out of their car, and they try to help me push it out. And pretty soon all 3 of us are full of mud and water. And we still didn't get it out. And so I asked this man if he would give me a lift downtown where we were supposed to meet my Uncle Louie. And the guy said, sure. And I didn't recognize the guy, and his name was John Wiedeward. Now, those of you familiar with the Gazette will recognize that name. Dave Wiedeward is our sports editor. And yes, John Wiedeward is a distant relative of Dave Wiedeward. But anyway, this John Wiedeward actually grew up within view of my Uncle Louie's farm. It's just the kind of community it is. Here he is, he's giving me a lift. And so Cheryl stayed with her car. I went to get my uncle, and we went out to his farm and got a truck and a tow rope. By the time we got back to the high school, here was Cheryl sitting at the exit waiting for us. It seems that a guy with a four-wheel drive truck and a tow rope came by and pulled out this whole string of cars that was stuck. That's what makes a small town special. It's people pulling together, cooperating, neighbors helping neighbors. It's a theme repeated again and again in my book, Death Beyond the Willows. This book is truly a love story involving a 1927 wedding day tragedy that happened in Portage to newlyweds Johnny Perkle of Marshall and Hazel Ferguson of Cottage Grove. I've been a journalist for more than a quarter of a century, and I've never heard of a tragedy that unfolded quite like this one. That's what compelled me to research about it and write about it. The late Zona Gale of Portage was a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. She once wrote, "Try to identify yourselves with the people you're going to write about. You must not only think with them, but live with them." For the past 8 years, excuse me, that's exactly what I tried to do. Now, Gail wrote a fictional short story about this tragedy in Portage, and she titled that short story Bridal Pond. But I believe that story actually led to some misconceptions about what really happened to this couple. And what I tried to do is dispel those misconceptions and bring the personalities of Johnny and Hazel back to life. And along the way, I found this story entails much more than a tragedy. It's a story of the family farm and how we're losing that part of our heritage. It's a story about an old car in the days when highways still offered primitive transportation. It's a story about spirituality and a clash of religions that divided the two families. And it's a story about how every person, every life, holds a library of stories. I started researching this story more than 8 years ago. That's when my parents, Wallace and Marge Peck, sold the Peck family farm in Marshall. Now, as I said, I didn't grow up on that farm, but I spent a lot of time there. I went hunting, I helped my dad fix or tear down aging farm buildings, and I mowed a lot of lawn. We had a 12 horsepower Massey Ferguson lawn tractor, and I'd drive that thing on the highway, on a county highway with a slow moving vehicle sign on the back, 2.5 miles every week in the summertime. Now, somehow I survived that, but the way people drive these days, I'd probably end up being roadkill. Anyway, the day before the farm sale was final, I went out and walked that farm one last time. And I wrote a nostalgic story for the Janesville Gazette about the profound sense of lost heritage that I was feeling. And it struck readers like nothing I'd ever written before. I received cards and letters and phone calls. One lady called and she said after reading my story, she went back out to the homestead that her family had sold off years earlier. She got out of the car, sat down by the road, and cried. And I felt there was a bigger story there somewhere that I could write, playing on the same theme of lost heritage and farm life. And this story provided that outlet. Decades ago, people truly raised families on the farm. They milked cows and raised hogs and beef cattle. They had hen houses and sold the eggs, butchered the chickens and sold those. And they had large vegetable gardens and small orchards to help feed their families as well. But they also relied on neighbors. They would get together to butcher animals, cut wood, or thrash grain come harvest time. It's a lifestyle that's quickly disappearing, as we all know. Let me illustrate this with a short segment from the book. It tells about my trip to Pine City, Minnesota, about an hour north of Minneapolis. You see, the newlyweds were on their way to see Ed Perkle, who is Johnny's oldest brother, and he farmed up north of Minneapolis. And a few years ago, Ed's lone surviving daughter, Margaret Cluck, and her husband Tony were taking me on a drive to see the former Ed Perkle farm. Margaret and Tony kept up a constant banter as Tony drove down gravel roads through farmland, swampland, and past woods before spilling onto Highway 11, approaching her home farm. The two kept pointing out places along the way. "That farm's empty now," one would say. "There's one that's still working," the other would reply. "That house was built in 1994, one would say. "That one went up last year," the other would add. Indeed, it was a dog's lunch of properties. Abandoned barns and active farms, junky yards and trailer homes, interspersed with new homes, some sprawling like former farm fields. It was just as Margaret had wistfully described on the phone. Houses are going up all along that road. The farmers are almost all gone. very few farmers left around here. It seems like they don't want the small dairy farmers anymore, so you might as well get out of it, I guess. We remember the good old days when you knew all your neighbors. There's not so much neighboring going on anymore. People come and go. You get new neighbors all the time. In those days, they didn't farm so big like they do now. I don't know how that meat could be that helpful on big farms with cows on top of manure piles. That's not the way God intended it. I don't know if this modern farming is going to be that good for us. In the fall of 1997, people in Marshall gathered to remember, reflect, and reminisce about that tragedy so long ago, 7 decades earlier. They had a memorial service at St. Mary's in Marshall, and it received widespread news coverage. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel did a front page story, and the State Journal in Madison also did, as well as the Portage paper. And at least 2 of the TV stations in Madison covered the story. And I saw those newscasts, and in one of them, they were showing the pews, and there's my dad sitting in the pews, and there's my Uncle Mike and my Uncle David. And it just struck me that I wanted to find out more about this story with the idea that maybe I could write a book about it. So originally my idea was to write a fiction based on a true story. And my research actually started here in Janesville. My wife Cheryl, who was at the time my fiance, I told her about the idea, and she was a little reluctant, and I think she understood the enormous undertaking I was embarking on, even if I didn't realize it at the time. But we kind of agreed that I would start with one phone call seeking one interview, and that phone call went to a lady that lived west of Janesville, and her name was Joanne Ramsier. She lived there, and she actually was a niece of the groom in this story. Now, Joanne was actually born 6 years after this tragedy took place. So what she was telling me was stories that she had heard from her family through the years, and she helped lay out the extensive Perkle family tree that night. And at the end of our talk, she said, well, you should talk to my sister Marion. She lives in Waterloo, and she's a few years older than me. So I went to talk to Marion. And Marion, after we talked, she said, well, you should talk to your Uncle Mike. He's a few years older than me, and he'll know a few more stories. So I did that, and so it went. And after 2 or 3 years, I'd interviewed about 40 people. Some of them I went back and talked to 3, 4, and even 5 times. And their stories ended up being almost whole chapters in the book. And other people just offered little pieces to the puzzle, and I appreciated all their insight because everybody helped build the story. At the time of my research, I was working as the Gazette's Sunday editor, and that meant that my weekends were actually Sunday and Monday. Now, Cheryl was working a normal week shift, and that meant I had Mondays to myself. And in the wintertime, I couldn't go golfing, of course, and I don't like to ice fish, and I thought, what am I going to do with myself on Mondays? And Cheryl said, find a hobby. Well, this book became my hobby. And one of my confidants in this project, some of you likely know, his name is John Helverson. He's on the Hedberg Library Board of Directors, and he also works for Bliss Communications, which owns the Janesville Gazette. John now is our head of our Walworth County operations, and we have the weekly newspaper in Delavan that he operates. Anyway, when I was doing my research, going every Monday to Marshall and Cottage Grove and Sun Prairie and Waterloo, I would come back with these fascinating little stories about rural life and growing up back then, and the things that people were telling me. And I would talk to John about these things. And after he heard these stories for several weeks, he said, Greg, you're a journalist. Tell him writing true stories is what you do for a living. Why would you try to fictionalize something when your strength is journalism and writing the truth? And I thought, he's right. And from that point on, I decided to stick to the true story. Now, being a newspaper journalist, I figured, hey, it's not like writing a newspaper story. I don't have to fit it into this little window. I can just start writing whenever the muse strikes me and keep writing. Well, after a few years, I had a manuscript that was close to 600 pages. Obviously, I'd gotten way off the point, which is this couple. And so I spent a winter boiling it down and leaving out some of the material, which had neat little stories, but they weren't connected enough to the central focus. And after I did that, I had another guy look at it. And this guy's name was Roger Miller. Now there's two Roger Millers in Janesville. One works for the Messenger. This is the other one. This Roger Miller actually was a copy editor for a while at the Gazette, and that's how I got to know him. And he's been reviewing books for about 30 years and now does it freelance nationwide. And so I asked him to take a look at my manuscript, and he did. And he basically ripped it to shreds. And I was frustrated, frankly, and I set it aside for a few days, and then I went back and looked at it. And he had made extensive notes about why he thought this and why he thought this needed to be left out. And after I really looked at it and thought about it, I thought, he's right. And so I kind of followed his pattern that he suggested and boiled it down to what became about a 220-page book. A 1927 Chevrolet remains a key part of this story. Johnny Perkle bought it from Lazarus Motors in Marshall, probably the same year as the wedding. It was the first car in the Perkle family, and he is rightly proud of it. It would serve as a temporary tomb for the newlyweds. Now, after the accident, Johnny's father, Joe Perkle, kept that car for a long time. Now, Joe and his wife Barbara lived in town in Marshall, and they had an old horse barn that served as their garage, and it stood right against the sidewalk. And so Joe kept that car and drove it until he died, and then after that, the car was sold to a family with a couple of young kids who drove it hard. The family eventually soon moved to California, and people in Marshall lost track of them. So nobody knows what happened exactly to that car. So I wanted to find an identical car to better describe it for readers. And so I contacted auto museums and antique car shows and antique car magazines, and nobody knew of a car exactly like this one. And finally, in a bit of irony, I found one by way of technology on the internet. I was at my home computer one day looking at a used car website, and they had an antique page, and sure enough, there's an antique 1927 Chevy for sale in northern Minnesota. So I called this guy named Josh Dahl and asked him to describe the car, and it sounded like the same car. And when we finally determined that it was identical, I decided to drive up there. 5 hours north of Minneapolis, about 9 hours from here. And I drove up there on a snowy November day to see this car. And Josh had just had a mechanic named Roger Ranasat do some work on the car. And it was sitting outside under a tarp at Roger's mechanic shop. And Josh Dahl and I rolled back the snow-covered tarp. Roger jumped in and fired it up. Amazingly, it came to life in just a second or two. He obviously knew his stuff. "Hop in and take it for a drive," Josh suggested. The offer floored me and made me anxious. I did not expect to drive the car. Riding along with Josh would be satisfying enough. I wasn't sure I knew enough about the unfamiliar controls to take it for a spin. "How about if I ride along while you drive it, and I'll take the wheel on the way back?" I replied. Josh agreed. We stepped onto the running boards, climbed in, and closed the doors, which seemed to work somewhat awkwardly. Josh gripped the smooth metal ball atop the stick shift on the floor, pulled it into first gear, and eased out the clutch. The car lurched forward. We headed down the snow-covered back road, Josh positioning the skinny 6-inch tires in the tracks left by a previous vehicle. "Rooga!" Josh hit the horn, and the resulting sound jogged memories of summertime parades. We chuckled. In third gear, the car started to chug, so Josh downshifted to second. Gas fumes enveloped us, and I thought they'd be enough to make one ill on a long trip, say from Marshall to Portage. But perhaps the fume problem was due to the busted-out back window, the shards of glass still covering part of the hole. Apparently, Josh's grandson had recently broken the window when he rolled it down. Josh hadn't had time to order a new pane. Soon we came to a T in the road, and Josh turned around. We exchanged seats and started back down the road. Unfortunately, there were no tracks to follow on this side. I felt the car sliding toward the shallow ditch. I edged the car over into the existing path. "I think I'll keep it over here," I said. I was driving on the wrong side of the road, which on this day was not a problem, because the 1927 Chevy was the only car on the road. Some of you have probably already read the book. Even those of you who haven't may have read stories about what happened to newlyweds Johnny and Hazel Perkle. You may have even heard about the clash of religions. The Catholic ceremony was at St. Mary's in Marshall, the same church I attended as a child. Hazel was converting to Catholicism, and her family balked at coming to the wedding. In fact, Hazel moved in with Johnny's parents in town several weeks before the wedding. She was an only child, and you can imagine how crushing it was for her parents when she died so suddenly. That leads to a twist in the story, one involving spirituality. I don't want to give the story away. I hope you'll buy a copy of the book. And I'd be honored to autograph it for you. Instead, let me tell you one other short story, a funny one about life in a rural community. It's the type of story you'll read again and again in my book. Death Beyond the Willows is indeed a tragedy, but it's far from dark. The book is full of humorous little stories about growing up, such as this one, told by a Marshall man. Jim Benish was born December 30th, 1925, making him less than 2 years old when his Uncle Johnny died, so he had no memory of Johnny. But he remembered that day of the bicycle race like it was yesterday. Jim recalled a time when he and his buddy, Charlie Scala, were freshmen in high school. They were returning to school after their lunch break, and their bike ride took them past Jim's grandpa and grandma Perkle's house. I had a beautiful bicycle with balloon tires. It was fancy. It had a horn and headlight. Everybody wanted to ride my bike. I had front brake drums on it. Charlie and Jim decided to race back to school. We were pedaling as fast as we could, Jim recalled, between puffs of cigarettes. I got to the corner in front of Grandma's and I whipped up on the sidewalk. Grandma was watching through the window. Grandma Perkle, busy at the kitchen sink, glanced out and saw danger unfold before her eyes. It happened so quickly she could do little but yell in futility. Grandpa Perkle, you see, was backing Johnny's car out of the garage. I looked back to see where Charlie was, and wham! The next thing I know, I was half on the running board and half on the ground, looking up at Grandpa, who was looking down at me through the car window. Grandma had been hollering out the window, "Jimmy, look out!" She almost fainted. Oh God, I hit that car. The impact dented the side of the car, but the way autos were built in those days, you could just hit it and it would pop back out, Jim said. However, the wheel and fork of his fancy bike were bent. Only Jim's pride was hurt. Grandpa never chewed me out or anything. I was surprised. We laughed about it later. Geez, you must have really been coming. Again, thanks for coming, thanks for listening, and thanks for buying the book. And remember, every life holds a library of stories. I urge you to listen to them, record them, and preserve them before those library doors close forever. Thank you. I actually have a regular schedule now because I'm not the Sunday editor anymore. I'm the editorial page editor, and so I work on normal Monday through Friday, which is nice for our weekends together, but is not so nice for trying to find time to write another book. Any other questions? Yes?
Have you kept the stories that you didn't use so that perhaps you could make them into little vignettes of some kind?
Yes, I have kept all those. In fact, one of them I keep thinking I would make a whole separate, it's almost a whole separate chapter about one guy that was a longtime resident of Marshall. And I'm thinking if sometime I ever write a book of short stories, that would be a good one to be included in that. All this stuff is on my home computer yet, which is as old as this book project is, 8 years. So I'm hoping it never crashes. Of course, I have hard copies of it too. And I have it on disc at work in case our house burns down or something. But I went to the Marshall Historical Society in January and spoke there. And some of the people there were excited about the prospect of me actually maybe using part of those stories as a little historical type of piece in the Waterloo Courier, which covers Marshall news. And if I find time to do that type of thing, there'd be some stories that I could develop out of that for that type of purpose.
You've written other books?
No, this is the only book I've written. Yeah. I have some other ideas. My wife actually likes the one that takes us to Hawaii to research. We ran into that story last spring down in Arizona about a tragedy in Hawaii, and she thinks that's the one I gotta write next. But I just want to take some time to promote this book and see where it goes, and then, like I said, I really don't have the time right now under my current schedule that I could see to actually write another book at this point. But maybe a few years down the road, some things will change, and I'll have the time again, because I do have a couple of different ideas. So. Yes.
Is the Marshall Historical Society selling your book?
Yes, they are. And well, they're actually not open, I think, until April. Again, they're closed for the winter time, but they do have some copies of it there, yes. And of course, Marshall doesn't have a bookstore or even a gift shop, so I've been selling them at the hardware store. It was a choice, grocery store or hardware store. I went with the hardware store. And I had a real nice signing there in Marshall at the library the first weekend that the book debuted, and a great signing up in Portage too that same weekend. So, any other questions? Well, thanks for your time, and I'll be in the back if anybody would like to get a signed copy of the book yet. Thanks for coming.